Here. Welcome, everyone. My name is Ian Wallace, and this is the latest installment of the Spring 2022 Department of Anthropology Colloquium Series here at the University of New Mexico, which sits on unceded indigenous territory and the traditional homelands of multiple sovereign nations, such as the Pueblo, Dene, and Apache peoples. Today, it is my pleasure to introduce two speakers who will be presenting together. Angelyn Bass, who is a research assistant professor in the UNM Department of Anthropology, and Douglas Porter, who is a research assistant professor in the Department of Engineering and Mathematical Sciences at the University of Vermont. Professor Bass is an architectural conservator specializing in the conservation of archaeological sites with a focus on architectural features, finishes, and wall paintings. And Professor Porter is also an architectural conservator who directs research focused on the investigation, stabilization, and repair of culturally significant historic and prehistoric sites and structures in cooperation with academic, federal, and nonprofit partners. The title of today's talk by Professor Bass and Professor Porter is A Legacy in Earth, Characterizing and Conserving Earthen Building Materials in Archaeological Sites. Thank you very much for being with us today.
Thanks, Ian, and everyone for joining us. We don't have a very strong internet connection, so I'm going to turn off our video for now, and we'll come back at the end of the presentation for questions. Okay, well, thank you again for joining us in our presentation on the characterization and conservation of earthen building materials on archaeological sites. Our research was accomplished primarily through grants awarded to the Anthropology Department from the National Park Service through the Colorado Plateau CESU. Our presentation was prepared in collaboration with my colleagues Doug Porter and 𝗏𝗏𝗍𝗍. We've been researching earthen materials together now for more than 15 years. Doug is from the School of Engineering, and he's the principal architectural conservator on these grants. He uses the results of our materials and our structural analyses to develop preservation strategies. 𝗏𝗏𝗍𝗍 is a mineralogist and manager of the SEM lab for the Institute of Meteoritics at UNM, and he was responsible for all of the micrographs and mineralogical analyses that we'll be referencing today.
We're going to look at a lot of micrographs. Yeah. A lot of mic work.
We also work regularly with archaeologists, Larry Nordby, Matt Goubard, and Josh Ramsey. Together with them, analyze ancient architecture and document a lot of the significant features that need to be preserved. But that's a much larger topic for another presentation. Today, we'll focus on earthen materials, and we're going to have a problem. Let's try. Let me stop sharing a minute. Try this again. We had this problem yesterday. Let's not try this one. Let's see.
Looks good.
Ah, there we go.
Yeah, video's off. So we're focusing on earthen materials and structural analyses for conservation purposes and for planning. We are including images of architectural spaces and their finishes. Some of them are embellished with geometric and abstracted landscape motifs. We will not be showing any figural representations. Most of these archaeological sites were excavated in the late 19th to mid 20th centuries, and they're open to the public to a certain degree. So we characterize these earthen building materials to better understand their composition, what they're made of, and how they're manufactured. We document all of these details that could be lost to weather and erosion, flooding, rock falls, even earthquakes. When damage occurs, There's often this urgency to repair or to stabilize, sometimes without fully understanding the materials, their properties, or their values. Analysis, it's essential for developing thoughtful conservation approaches, and ones that preserve the legibility and authenticity of these places, and that do not foreclose on the many values they continue to hold for living cultures and descendant communities. So I've been studying and conserving earthen and lime plasters in Americas since the 1990s. Doug has been focused for decades, nearly 2 decades, on the roles of engineering in historic preservation. Our work together really reflects these 2 areas of focus. It includes characterization of mortars and plasters and structural assessments that contribute to the risk management programs in these parks. Our structural studies are probably more about identifying what doesn't need treatment. And I included this short quote from the Bird Charter to express that idea: as much as necessary, but as little as possible. With these studies, we're looking to identify stabilization needs fairly precisely so that over-treatment's avoided. So preservation of plasters on archaeological sites, it's difficult in any scenario, but it's especially challenging when they're made of earth. Many earthen plasters and features are still intact at some of this today, largely because they're protected by alcoves or constructed shelters. So early in the 20th century, earthen plasters were frequently lost in the years following excavation. This is Lowry Ruin in Colorado, excavated in 1931. Multiple attempts to conserve and exhibit the wall paintings ultimately resulted in their delamination and loss. Today, little remains of the decorative finishes. Point them out there. Because of the difficulty of in situ preservation, murals were often lifted and transferred to museums. Removal is no longer done for so many reasons, and we'll discuss that a little later in the presentation. So the earthen archaeological sites we'll focus on today are all located in the desert Southwest, and they're associated with descendant communities throughout the Four Corners area of Utah, Colorado, New Mexico, and Arizona. First one is Bear Ladder in Natural Bridges National Monument in Utah. It's a 60-room alcove site of 2 levels. It was constructed between 1100 and 1270. Bandelier National Monument in New Mexico, where there are thousands of cavates excavated into these volcanic tuff outcrops. They were used between 1100 and 1725, with peaks in population in the 1400s. We've been working at 2 alcove sites, Antelope House and White House in Canyon de Chelly National Monument. At Antelope House, which you see here, are basket maker settlements constructed as early as 500. There's a 4-story tower that was in use at least until 1270, as well as Navajo structures and modifications that were made to the sites in the 19th and 20th centuries. Montezuma Castle. It's a large 5-story Sinaguan cliff dwelling in central Arizona. It was constructed between 1150 and 1300, and its use may have been primarily defensive. The upper and lower cliff dwellings at Tonto National Monument, also in Arizona, they were constructed by the Salado culture group between 1325 and 1450, well after Montezuma Castle. And finally, the Great House at Casa Grande ruins. This is a 4-story, 25-room monumental structure built by the ancestral Sonoran Desert people between 1300 and 1450. This is the only site we're discussing today that has a constructed shelter. It was designed and built in the 1930s. The rest of the sites are in natural alcoves or they're carved into rock.
When these sites were excavated a century or more ago, archaeologists were primarily concerned with material culture, like ceramics and artifacts. In general, they seem to feel that careful study of the earthen materials used in their construction was unlikely to accomplish more than confirming that soil from the site was smeared on nearly every surface. The revival of traditional earthen building technology around the world, particularly in Europe and the Middle East, has helped to fuel an interest in the micromorphological characterization of earthen materials on archaeological sites. And relatively recent technological developments make it possible to learn a lot from small samples. Our work indicates that earthen building materials at these sites we're going to show you today were selected and manipulated for specific architectural purposes and provide glimpses into sophisticated ancient building craft that manages to convey a great deal of the builder's design intent. In conducting our studies, we've come to rely on the characterization procedures outlined on this slide to capture information on material function, the distribution of mortars and plasters at a site, embellishments, the methods of application, micromorphology, element chemistry, and the mineralogy of the soils that were used in building. We don't have time to discuss each of these individually, but by combining visual inspection with standard bulk soil tests and instrumental analyses that for us have really come to focus on the scanning electron microscope, we've been able to gather information on particle size distribution, the hydric state of mixes at the time of their application, ground mass characteristics, and the chemistry and mineralogy of these soils. And what we're finding is that these earthen materials were manipulated in ways that we'd expect to find detailed in mortar and plaster specifications being written today. At all the sites that we'll show you, particle size distribution was manipulated depending on the thickness of the layer, giving the builder some control over shrinking and cracking and the interaction of the dry materials with weather. For materials installed in thicker lifts, the proportion of water in the mix was limited, which helps to reduce slumping and to shorten the drying times. For materials exposed to weather, like roof and exterior wall plasters, they're more likely to be well graded and thoroughly blended. Conditions that we'd look to address in mortar specifications, and conditions that are likely to contribute to the durability of the materials. These are also hard to achieve except by pre-mixing the dry ingredients. And the mineral and chemical characteristics of the mixes were manipulated to produce finishes that were selected for color, sheen, or toughness. Particle size distribution is important in the context of mortar and plaster design for a number of reasons, including that manipulation of the aggregate fraction can produce denser mixes, which can result in improved dimensional stability and resistance to weather. Standard bulk analyses will give us particle distribution data, but they require samples of 300 grams or more. Think in terms of half a quart. The better way for gathering particle size information for finished plasters and washes is by analyzing thin section micrographs using the image analysis software in the scanning electron microscope. In the micrograph on the right, we've identified 5 finish layers based in part at least on particle size. And we've collected measurements of several of the larger particles in each of the mixes, in that way gathering basic information about aggregate distributions for each of the plaster and wash layers in the stratigraphy. The amount of water in the mix affects the plastic behavior of structural materials and plasters. Relatively dry mixes are less prone to slumping, so walls can be constructed in larger lifts. Drier plasters can be applied in thicker coatings. All of these can speed the rate of construction. Wetter materials, on the other hand, are easier to spread. They form thinner layers and can be applied with a brush like paint. We gather information on the relative quantity of water in the mixes in a handful of ways. Drier mixes are typically characterized by the polyconcave vugs and packing voids that you see in these images, places where the relatively dry material failed to slump into the empty spaces. Drier materials also frequently contain underhydrated clay lumps or clods that were created in quarrying the material that weren't softened by water during mixing, and so have survived more or less intact in the thin sections. These contrast with the features we find in materials applied in a viscous or liquid state, which often include abundant vesicle pores, the dark places you see in these images that result from air bubbles or excess water in the mix. It's less common to find underhydrated clay lumps in these materials, and frequently silt-sized aggregates account for a larger proportion of the mix. These smaller particles require more water by volume to wet the particle surfaces. The microscope also yields information on the ground mass characteristics of the mix, the ways in which the coarse and fine fractions or binder and aggregates are combined. These characteristics can include binder aggregate ratios, the degree of blending or mixing, whether the aggregate fraction can be considered well graded or not, and the porosities that typify the mixes. Some of this information we gather just by noting whether the coarse aggregates appear to be distributed throughout the mix in a more or less homogeneous way, for example, or whether particles of multiple sizes are more or less equally represented in the mix. In that micrograph on the right, we're looking at a roof plaster from Antelope House that I would characterize as well blended and well graded. And you can see in the image how smaller particles fill voids created by the larger particles, resulting in a relatively dense, less porous mix. We can also get binder, aggregate, and void proportions by manipulating micrograph histograms and calculating optical totals using the image analysis software. We're looking at the same roof plaster from Antelope House, and you can tell from the image on the right, for example, that the optical porosity is very low, that the binder fraction, which is represented in the image on the left, is roughly a third of the aggregate fraction. So we've got a 1 to 3 binder aggregate ratio, all of this kind of standard stuff in mortar and plaster design. Changes in element chemistry or mineralogy are important to us because they can signal alternately sourced materials or materials selected for a special purpose. This turns out to be important in the context of pigments, for example, where sometimes different pigments are selected to produce essentially the same visual results. We get element chemistry information using the EDS function of the microscope, and working with Mike, we find these useful for tentative identification of minerals and mineral groups. I don't know, maybe 95% of the time, where the regional geology kind of controls the content of most of the plasters and mortars we're looking at. In this micrograph, we're looking at plaster stratigraphy from the Great House at Casa Grande. And I don't know if you can see my cursor, but we've got a finished plaster on the left where you see the larger aggregates. That finished plaster is coated with a very thin clay wash and an even thinner wash of gypsum. This is the there it is. This is the finished stratigraphy on the interior of every room of the Great House, and the homogeneity of the effect is striking. The same red color is on the wall of every room, and the plaster has a reflective quality that is thought by some researchers to symbolize water. The EDS spectrum includes calcium and sulfur peaks that we would assume is related to the gypsum, and what looks like a carbonate clay. In this case, we were interested in the clay. The iron peaks look too small to account for the consistent red color of the wash. The XRD spectrum identifies the clay as 𝗵𝗿𝐺𝗫𝗍𝗫, which is interesting for a couple of reasons. For one, 𝗵𝗿𝐺𝗫𝗍𝗫 appears consistently in this red wash, but we don't find it consistently in the other earthen materials at this site, suggesting an alternate source. 𝗵𝗿𝐺𝗫𝗍𝗫 was used traditionally in the preparation of lake pigments, which consist of an organic dye, which don't show up in our analyses, added to an inorganic medium. Maya blue is a best known example, which consists of the clay with an indigo dye added to it. 𝗵𝗿𝐺𝗫𝗍𝗫 has excellent hiding characteristics so that substrate colors don't bleed through even very thin layers of the finish, like our 100 micron or so thick wash. Based on these considerations, it seems likely to us that this wash relies on a lake pigment for its red color.
So the earthen materials at these sites are classified according to their function, which you see on the right, and we'll go through those briefly. These functional groups differ from one another in terms of their particle size distribution, their surface texture, how they were mixed, and how they were applied. Not every site we're showing you today has features representative of all these groups, but all of them feature a majority of them. So earth was used as a structural material, either as a bedding mortar for unit masonry here at Antelope House, or like puddled earth or cob construction at Casa Grande, which you see here. Construction with earth was typically phased in these lifts or construction episodes to minimize slump. These lifts are typically 1/2 to 1 meter high. The harding material, you can see there, forms the center of the wall and is covered by a thick leveling plaster. The thickness of the walls at grade is over 1 meter. By the way, each of these functional groups, we've included a table on the upper right that summarizes the micromorphological characteristics. Leveling plasters were applied as the last stage of each construction episode, and they were used to smooth uneven wall planes inside and out. Here we're looking at the upper cliff dwelling at Tonto. You can see the horizontal lift lines in the plaster representing the individual construction episodes. These plasters typically include coarse aggregates, usually gravels, and they're applied as very dry mixes. We often encounter unhydrated clay lumps in the thin sections. Margin plasters, they were used for closing wall penetrations around roof frames and where masonry walls meet the alcove surfaces. These typically have a distinctive fingerprint texture, and that comes from pushing the plaster into the voids. They're often very thick, and again, include abundant coarse aggregates. Sometimes these margin plasters can be dated because they were often renewed with the roof frames or hatches when those were repaired. We could get not before dates based on the dendro studies of the associated beams. Roof plasters, they were placed over a closing material. You can see the closing material, generally a layer of adlatillas or saguaro ribs, and even woven mats. The plaster was typically applied in a single coat up to 15 centimeters thick to form a water-resistant exterior surface or a plaster substrate for some upper floors. Roof plasters also contain gravel-sized aggregates, and you can see the packing voids in the thin section on the right. So floor plasters were used to level surfaces at grade and to cover the roof plasters in the upper levels. They're typically layered. There'll be an initial thick, coarse textured coat, then covered with subsequent thin renewal layers, consisting largely of clays and silts. The floors and wall plasters were often renewed at the same time. So plasters were also used to construct built-in architectural features for weaving, food production, and to frame wall openings like doorways. Some of these features you can see here include like a raised platform or floor ridges. This is at in Frijoles Canyon and Bandelier. They're also used in doorway jambs and for floor level loom anchors, those from natural bridges. And they're also used to mount collars around hearths and mealing bins. Sometimes the earthen materials are so well preserved in these sites, you can make out details like hand and fingerprints in the surface. And you can find remnants of hair and bits of fiber left in the floors from the weaving activities. These little ephemeral details immediately connect us to the people who live there. So finished plasters, they can vary from, that's how the wall is finished plaster, vary from 1 to 10 millimeters thick. They were used to smooth the wall surfaces, to impart color, and as a ground for other washes and embellishments. On the left, we're looking at a multi-layered plaster and a whitewash from Lower White House in 𝗏𝗏𝗏. There have been up to 100 individual plaster layers found in rooms at other sites. The washes, my favorites, they tend to be less than 1 millimeter thick and even thinner. And they were used for renewing wall surfaces to impart a color or a sheen and to execute painted designs. Washes were frequently applied with a brush in a very liquid state. In the micrograph on the right, you can see that there's this stratigraphy of alternating plaster and wash layers. On the left, layer 5, plaster layer, layer 6, a wash, layer 7, a plaster, layer 8, a wash. This is relatively common, this layering on walls in public spaces that were frequently renewed. On the left is a white, red, and yellow colored wash at Lower White House. Doug mentioned lake pigments. In analyzing these washes, we identified kaolinite and high calcium clays as the principal mineral constituents, but again, only traces of iron oxides, which is surprising for the reds and yellows. This suggests that the pigments may be organic. There are ethnographic accounts of yellow and red lake pigments in the context of both Hopi and Navajo painting traditions. We're going to be working with the National Museum in Berlin to try and identify some of the organic components or the dyes. So in some of these alcove sites, there were multi-story masonry walls built next to the cliff, and the rock face served as the back of the rooms. The alcoves were plastered at the same time as the masonry walls. When the walls collapse, sometimes the only evidence of their arrangement is the plastered rock face. In this image, it's the area, we're showing the area between the Upper and Lower White House. And there were remnants of plastered walls that show us stacks of rooms and two flanking 4-story towers where they once stood. So you can see that's one of the towers, and this is 4 stories of another tower. So color, as Loa was saying, figures prominently in some of these sites. The earthen finishes primarily washes of varying colors and sheens were used to embellish the surfaces and to define architectural features on both the interior and exterior of these rooms. At 𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏, there's an extensive use of white. Its placement on the exterior walls sort of emphasizes shared areas like courtyards and may also help brighten the interior spaces. It's possible that the selection of colors for finishing walls reflects beliefs about color symbolism. The use of different pigments to achieve the same visual effect also suggests this. At 𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏 and Tonto, we found multiple white pigments, including kaolinite, crushed feldspars, gypsum, calcite. Paints, they confer a certain power on the places where they're applied. And rituals developed around sourcing and the use of certain pigments, the mixing and application of the paints, and their eventual destruction or masking with coats of plaster in renewal events.
Now, before we leave this slide, I just want to point out that Matt Goubard, Angelyn mentioned him early in the presentation, and one of his publications is listed here, will be presenting on the white pigments at Tonto at SAA next week. Tomorrow.
Maybe. Yeah. So in addition to the colored washes, we found these micaceous washes. at both the Casa Grande and Canyon de Chelly. And they seem to have been selected for their sheen. Some of these layers, these micaceous layers, they're buried in the stratigraphies, and they only become apparent in these thin sections. Earlier in the presentation, Doug showed you a micrograph from Casa Grande, where these red micaceous and gypsum washes were layered consistently on every interior. Here is another example at Antelope House. There's this thin micaceous layer, one of 18 plaster and wash coats in this room. In the detail, you can see how the particles are imbricated, and they consist primarily of muscovite and biotite in this carbonate clay mix. This type of an embellishment probably added sort of an interesting shimmer to the space when it was lit by firelight. So designs were also incised in the finished plasters. They can be geometric, like the spiral at Casa Grande on the left, or representational, like the sandal patterns at Bear Ladder. At the Bear Ladder site, there were over 25 different sandal patterns and other textiles that were incised into the plaster surface. So in the 14th century, there was substantive changes in the style of wall paintings, including this expanded color palette and a depiction of natural and supernatural beings in ceremonial events. In excavating Owatawee Pueblo in the 1930s, Harvard's Peabody Museum found over 25 rooms decorated with hundreds of earthen painted plaster layers. In these images, you can see that the murals were detached one by one and mounted on masonite. At the time, lifting paintings was thought to be one way to preserve them. Today, though, removing any architectural elements from their setting, this contravenes accepted heritage conservation principles, which seek to preserve the wall paintings in their original context. And it also disrupts essential cultural and natural and spiritual connections between the place and the paintings. In this image on the right, I'm conserving some of the Owatawee murals in the collection of the Museum of Northern Arizona with Leslie Rayner in 2003.
Angelyn mentioned earlier that we've been working on structural assessments at most of these sites. Earthen architecture comes apart in more or less predictable ways, which are illustrated in these two photographs. Roof and floor frames collapse, eliminating the bracing in multi-story construction. Subsurface conditions result in differential settlement, which causes leaning walls and the collapse of masonry over door and window openings. Erosion at the bases of walls, especially tall walls, in this case 3 stories tall, increases their instability, and the long vertical through wall cracks that you see all over this structure, some of them most certainly caused by earthquakes, isolate tall wall segments that are too slender to stand on their own. We're going to briefly describe just a couple of case studies that illustrate the roles of digital documentation and computer modeling in the assessment of these structures. Angelyn mentioned that one of the big picture goals with these studies is to identify the elements most at risk. That's the as much as necessary line in the borough charter. Identifying what needs treatment usually helps to identify what doesn't need treatment, and that's the as little as possible line in the charter. And identifying what doesn't need treatment is really one of the principal ways that these studies help to protect resource integrity and authenticity by taking big portions of the structures off the repair list. At Bandelier, this is one of the first projects where I got to work with 𝗏𝗏𝗶𝗏𝗃. Cave 8B2 has a partition wall that is essentially the last surviving element of the Pueblo construction that fronted this outcrop. The stonework is set in earthen mortar. There are earthen plasters inside and out. And the wall is threatened by, can't find my cursor, a big chunk of the outcrop that has detached and is resting on the top of the wall, and by erosion of the tuff at the base of the wall. The park wanted a way to monitor changes in condition. We scanned the wall, and John Oxendorf and Matt DeYoung, the engineers on our team, constructed a discrete element model that captured wall and outcrop geometry accurately and allowed the team to explore collapse scenarios virtually by manipulating the material properties like joint strength and altering the support conditions. In the model, or in these images, you're looking at progress toward collapse. In the model, we learned that the detaching rock at the top of the wall actually improves the wind resistance of the wall by loading it. And as we approached virtual collapse, we could see stresses developing in the wall that we think are likely to be accompanied by the cracking of the stonework, the cracking and loss of plaster and mortar. These are conditions that the park can monitor through repeat photography. We're back to Casa Grande at the Great House, where there have been questions about the seismic vulnerability of the structure, at least since the late 1880s, when a large wall segment collapsed as the result of what people thought was a powerful earthquake. To explore the seismic susceptibility of the structure, the team developed a set of tools for a dynamic analysis of the most vulnerable wall segments, which are color-coded here in the model. The tools combine the asymmetric geometry of the walls as captured in LiDAR scans, used off-the-shelf software for generating the models, and then the engineers developed computational tools for analysis of individual rocking mechanisms. This assessment provided a quantitative evaluation of the overturning capacity of each of the at-risk segments, and in this particular case, we found that none of them is in danger of falling solely as the result of ground shaking. That means that the repair program the park was anticipating was unlikely to have the desired effect, and we were able to take that particular intervention off the list.
So we're not climate change experts. And in fact, we're just now planning our first project where we'll include an environmental engineer on the team to help us identify potential climate impacts. We're working in national parks where resource managers are increasingly looking to address these impacts in their preservation planning. So over much of the American Southwest, climate change is resulting in longer periods of drought and with more intense rains. The problem isn't an increase in total annual rainfall. It's that half of that total might fall in a period of 3 to 4 days of rainy weather on the vegetation depleted soils, resulting in these flash floods and significant site losses. We'll leave you with a short case study that illustrates how change in climate is in effect swamping preservation planning for archaeological and historic sites. When I was working at Bandelier National Monument, there was a multidisciplinary project led by the USGS and the National Park Service to understand changes in the landscape and the ground cover that were causing widespread soil erosion, and with that, loss of archaeological sites and artifacts. This aridification of the ecological system region-wide was caused by both anthropogenic and natural events that include a century of overgrazing, fire suppression, and drought. Sheet erosion was exposing artifacts and literally washing them away. After a heavy rain, sediment traps that were intended to measure topsoil loss were often filled with ceramic sherds and lithics. In one storm alone, there were over 1,000 artifacts in one of the catches. In the late 1990s, a 100-acre test area was established. So these crews came in. They cut the small junipers, lopped larger branches, and distributed it over the thinned area. This reduced surface water flow and soil loss and increased water and nutrient infiltration into the ground. This successfully encouraged the growth of new perennial grasses and shrubs. After just 2 years, soil erosion and exposure of artifacts in the test area essentially ceased. So the study, it provided a way forward for the park to manage these at-risk sites and landscapes. From 2007 to 10, the park then treated a 5,000-acre area in the pinyon juniper woodland in the same manner. And to date, more than 6 million acres have been similarly treated in the larger arid Southwest. So in 2011, the Las Conchas fire, which was started by a downed power line, burned over 160,000 acres, including a significant portion of the upper Frijoles Canyon with some of the highest density of archaeological sites. At the time, it was the largest wildland fire in New Mexico history. It affected more than 60% of the park and more than 50% of the archaeological sites. Later that year, heavy rains caused extensive flooding, threatening principal archaeological and historic sites in the park. And this video graphically demonstrates that climate change does not recognize park boundaries, and that we've reached a point where only the coordinated effort of nations can prevent the worst effects of a warming climate. So fires like Las Conchas are becoming more frequent and much larger. In 2021, more than 6 million acres were burned in the US alone. And these fires are burning hotter, with little vegetation for leaving little vegetation for initiating new growth. With the loss of ground cover, the potential for devastating floods increases. So the documentation of these sites, including the LiDAR scans that capture site geometry, and detailed characterization of the earthen materials is one way we're trying to manage and to mitigate loss, albeit an insufficient response to the larger risks. So in this time of unprecedented climate changes, we can no longer rely on past responses, which are now inadequate. We need to engage in adaptive learning and large-scale cooperative problem solving. We need students interested in the effects of climate change on archaeological sites and who are prepared to think in new and different ways about how heritage is owned, named, interpreted, managed, and protected. So students have been involved in all aspects of our projects, in all aspects of the work, from site inspections to SEM microscopy to structural analysis and monitoring. We'd like to thank them for their enthusiasm, their perspective, and their commitment. I'd also like to thank the UNM faculty and staff who supported these projects, and to the National Park Service, CESU, and the descendant communities for allowing us to work with you at these important and very powerful places. Our research is funded for the next several years, and we have paid positions and scholarships for students. Please feel free to contact me or Doug if you're interested in being involved. So thank you for joining us. Here's a bibliography of some of our reports and the publications on the work we presented today. And I'll leave that up for a little bit, but I'll turn our video back on if there are any questions.
Thank you. That was a really wonderful talk. Thank you very much. If anybody has any questions, I suggest you just turn your camera on and go ahead and ask them yourself. Hello.
Hello. Thank you for that wonderful talk. You mentioned climate change, and I've been thinking a lot about cement and concrete and its contribution to climate change. It's one of I think the third largest contributor to greenhouse gases, Portland cement. I was wondering if you guys had thought at all about historical techniques for the manufacture of cement, and whether there was anything we could learn contemporaneously about how we could create greener cement, greener mixes that allow us to achieve the same thing, since we've been making cement for a very long time. And I'll mute.
Turning to you.
Yeah, thanks. We, in some of our work with historic buildings, we have run into natural cements. So these are limes made from limestones that have elevated clay content in them. And up into the early 20th century, masons were buying limes locally, essentially, that they didn't comply with an ASTM standard. They were made from local limestones that conferred properties that differed from place to place to place. That in some places was turned out to be a nice thing, but the lack of consistency from place to place made it hard to develop building standards that inform building codes. That is really my only connection to your question, and I'll just say that burning lime or burning limestone to make lime consumes an incredible quantity of energy. And Angelyn presented last week on a Maya site in the Petén in Guatemala, where one of the suggestions that archaeologists are contemplating about the dwindling use of lime over time, going in the pre-classic period from these lime plaster painted panels that were 4 to 6 inches thick, let's say, to late classic or middle classic paintings on what amounted to a layer of lime wash over earthen plasters. That I guess there's a serious question being debated today about whether the Maya depleted forest reserves that are today so enormous, it's hard to imagine that could have happened. I know that lots of research is going on for alternate binder materials in concretes. Concretes are being used to store water, to reduce the coverage of sites with impermeable layers. I don't know much about what these binders consist of, I think, build with wood. And let's use less concrete.
American Institute for Conservation has what's called, I think, life cycle assessments, and they're looking at the cost of materials and alternative materials for use in conservation, which is very different from the building arts. But that may be a place to look. I haven't looked specifically at related to concrete and concrete production, but there may be something there that either addresses that question or gives you an idea about how to pursue addressing that question of life cycle use and carbon footprint.
And before we leave the topic entirely, I can't help but think your comment is a plug for reuse of existing buildings. That the inventory of existing buildings is enormous, and that when we don't take them apart and put them in the landfill and then have to replace them with new concrete, new steel, and glass, we are reducing our carbon footprint.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
It was a long answer. A long non-answer.
A long partial answer.
There's a question in the chat, and I had a similar question. There's a question in the chat from a graduate student, John, and it's about the kind of the degree to which ethnography plays a role, or ethnography or interactions with collaborating ancestral communities or descendant communities in how you interpret and learn about construction structures. Specifically, John says, has the team worked with local pueblos and interviewed them about wash techniques and murals known in some of these ancestral structures studied? But I'm generally interested how the collaboration with descendant communities goes, and the role of ethnography.
Well, on this Matt Goubard paper on colored washes and colored meaning, cultural meaning, was in cooperation with some of his Zuni?
Hopi, I think.
Hopi colleagues. And it's, we haven't engaged in it much yet because we're just at this point looking at the material properties. But we have a new project coming up at Canyon de Chelly, where we are hoping to pursue a digital humanities grant to partner with local pueblos and the American Studies program to develop that part of the analysis and work. So it's in the works. We just haven't done a lot of it yet because it's not our area of expertise, really, but we have missed it. And what is missing from a lot of this work, we discussed it earlier, was the connection to the material, the movable culture that left these sites and is now scattered about museums. And then the connection to modern cultures and groups and artistic practices today. So we include Indigenous students on all of our projects. And we also include artists on our projects to create contemporary responses to these sites. And we feel so honored to be able to be there and experience them, and are trying to extend that also to students and to artists.
I want to respond to that a little bit too. We talked a long time today about lake pigments because we're fascinated by them, and because the analytical techniques that we're accustomed to using miss them.
Don't work for that.
Yeah, and they leave us with mysteries, and we started to unpack this issue a little bit in our work at Canyon de Chelly, and we were pointed in the direction of ethnographic information related to yellow and red lake pigments by native craftspeople involved in our work at that part. And it might seem like instrumentally it would be a simple thing to identify a dye, but a dye that's hundreds of years old and relied on a relatively tiny amount of organic material initially turns out to be extremely ephemeral. And in finding these ethnographic accounts, or in having these ethnographic accounts of red and yellow pigments provided to us, we have some concrete information about specifically what we're looking for in these samples. And that gives us hope that we may be able to identify these materials. It's customary, I would say, to conduct these searches and come up with very little of substantive value. I'm hopeful, knowing that that these pigments may be related to specific plants growing in canyons de Ché and Del Muerto, that we may have more success.
Great, thank you. I actually have another question, unless somebody else has a question. Does somebody have a question? You mentioned early on in the talk that there's been a recent resurgence in interest in earthenware building methods and in different parts of the world. I read an article not long ago that said that there's also a growing interest in that among people in the Southwest. And I'm wondering if your work on historic and prehistoric architecture is any way connected with that community of people who are really interested in sort of using some of these more old methods today to construct homes. And I was even thinking about how if there was some connection between them, to some extent, like people applying these models today or methods today, you could almost like test certain hypotheses in kind of like an experimental archaeology kind of way. Yeah.
I'm glad you brought that up. The connection between the revival of interest in traditional earthen construction and micromorphological characterization of archaeological earth is kind of tangential, but knowing some of the background, it was very important in the sense in which you mentioned. It is not an accident that some of the early micromorphological studies were conducted in the Middle East and in Europe, France, big time, because there were revivals in earthen building, traditional earthen building technologies going on at the time, and archaeologists had access to craftspeople to do experimental archaeology. So people were creating samples, cutting thin sections, looking at them under the microscopes, and creating these thin section collections that number in the thousands at this point. And I think Angela and I probably both have to say, part of what draws us, propels our interest in these ancient materials is our love of earthen architecture in the Southwest. And
well, I just want to throw in a couple things about that. Experimental archaeology went on at Montezuma Castle, or 𝗔𝗫𝗁, with Matt Goubard and his crew, using some of the mixed proportions from our analysis. And then they added recommendations, binder recommendations from their Hopi grandmothers, trying it with honey and trying it with other additives to see how that went. So it did influence some experimental archaeology locally. But there's a plug I want to make too. There's an international conference on the study and conservation of earthen architecture this summer in Santa Fe. Hundreds of people interested in earthen architecture, living cultures, ancient sites, modern construction, everything from the science and the micromorphology to workshops on techniques of adobe construction and plastering will be taking place in early June.
In Santa Fe.
In Santa Fe, which is extraordinary because it's an opportunity for UNM and for many people. I know the architecture program at UNM is a partner. So it's a good time to get those questions answered and to see about earthen architecture all over the world.
Oh yeah, that's a cool conference.
This is the Terra conference, and there are several partners, including the Getty Conservation Institute, 𝗖𝗵𝗆𝗆, and
University of Pennsylvania, and the Vanishing Treasures program of the National Park Service.
Angelyn and I belong to a scientific committee in 𝗖𝗵𝗆 that's devoted to the study of earthen architecture. And you're right, the same sort of revival is taking place in the United States as we've seen in Africa, the Middle East, and big parts of Europe. It's really cool.
Yeah, it is really cool. All right. Any other questions? Well, if not, please join me in thanking the speakers for today. That was a really wonderful talk. So many beautiful slides. It really was beautiful and compelling. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Have a wonderful weekend, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.